Jacob and Sophie had been quiet for some time now. Jacob was sitting right next to her on the bed and could feel her body heat on his left side. The fragrance of Sophie's body mist filled Jacob's nostrils, and for a few moments he was lost in thought. He told Sophie to stop falling, but now he wanted her to, just so that he could catch her again and feel the warmth of her skin on his hands. Jacob turned his head towards Sophie and saw that she was also deep in thought, but not thoughts like his. It seemed that Sophie was still upset, and the feeling wasn't going to go away that easily. He slowly got up from the bed to leave her with her thoughts. Sophie looked at him.
"Where are you going?"
Jacob turned around to look at her. "I'm just taking a tour of your room," he said gently. Sophie didn't answer him. She probably didn't know what to say. "I'll leave if you're feeling uncomfortable," Jacob continued.
"No!"
Sophie exclaimed.
"You can stay here."
Jacob knew she wasn't okay with the fiancé situation, but perhaps she could use a friend who could understand her situation, because he was in the same boat. "That's what I'll do then. I'll be a friend." He asked Sophie, "Is there anything to do around here?" Sophie got up from the bed, sat in front of the computer, and reactivated the screen with her mouse.
"We can play games on my computer,"
she said, as the desktop wallpaper emerged. It was a picture of her in a bikini at the beach. Her delicate skin glowed radiantly under the sun, amongst the blue waves. She had a bright smile, and she was sticking out her tongue in the picture. Based on the happy picture, it was clear she seemed to love the beach. She quickly switched the screen, as she must have noticed that Jacob was looking at the picture. Jacob couldn't see her expression, but she was blushing. A little embarrassed, Sophie distracted herself by playing a game. She focused on continuing her last level, and as she did, she forgot that Jacob was still in the room. Out of boredom, Jacob picked out a random book from the bookshelf across the room and sat down on a chair near the balcony. Soon, he was lost in the book. Sophie suddenly remembered Jacob and turned her head around only to see him reading quietly. She couldn't help but glimpse at him in between gaming keystrokes.
"He doesn't look like a bad guy. He is cute too. But to marry him?"
Sophie felt internally conflicted. She pouted as she carried on with her computer game. Time flew by as she fought through many levels. She was deeply focused on the game now, as more and more enemies kept showing up on her screen. The weapons Sophie had weren't enough to defeat them, and she couldn't do nothing but watch the enemies break through the door. She failed the level 5 times and finally got frustrated by it. She threw the mouse on the desk as if she was mad at her computer. "Don't take it out on the mouse." A voice came from behind her. She turned around to see Jacob standing behind her.
"He's been here the whole time?"
Sophie couldn't control her blush. She blamed herself for being too focused on the game and forgetting about Jacob. However, it wasn't completely her fault, as they were in her bedroom and she had always been alone in there.
"I can't get through this level,"
she admitted sheepishly. "Lead the enemies to the dead end in the labyrinth, then get them to turn on one another," Jacob said.
"That would never work."
Sophie wasn't convinced. "Your way isn't working either, is it?" Jacob said. Sophie pondered over Jacob's idea for a few minutes before she started the level again. She successfully passed the level using Jacob's strategy. Did it work? Who had returned to his reading chair?
No,
said Sophie. She didn't want him to think that he was right. Jacob stood up, pretending to go over and check. Sophie quickly exited the game in panic. However, her bikini photo was now in sight, and she bit her lip to control her blush.
Don't look at it.
Sophie stood up hastily to block his view. She was conscious about Jacob or anyone else seeing her in a swimsuit. Jacob chuckled and teased her. I've already seen the live version. Why can't I see the picture? Sophie gritted her teeth and clenched her fists. She hit Jacob on his chest. Thanks to the loss of her internal core, it wasn't a strong hit. Instead of causing pain to Jacob's chest, it felt like she had put her hand through a wall. Sophie smiled at Jacob's reaction because he was covering his chest and pretending to be hurt.
Huh. I shall teach you another lesson if you say something like that again,
she said playfully. She then sat down and continued with her computer game. Jacob was tired of reading, so he dragged a chair beside her and watched her play. Sophie was, in fact, bored of playing alone, so she was glad he came to watch her. Not to mention she certainly needed some help with some levels. Pick up a potion here. Here, collect food to cook later. Here comes the last wave of enemies. Get the bombs ready. Jacob kept on instructing on the side.
So annoying, I know.
Sophie blamed the hard levels as she did what Jacob said. Her hand was moving quickly with the mouse. The two of them were too focused on the screen to realize Helen had quietly pushed open the door a bit to take a look at them. She stood by the door for a while. After seeing that the two of them were getting along, she smiled and walked away, delighted. Time flew until they reached the last level, and soon it was time for Jacob to leave. Helen knocked on the door. Sophie paused the game, and Jacob snapped out of the game as well.
Okay, enough gaming. Come downstairs,
Helen said in a gentle tone. Sophie turned her head to face the door to look at Helen, and then turned to look at Jacob. She suddenly realized that they were sitting very close to each other, so when she turned, her face was almost touching Jacob's. She slowly moved away from him, and her face turned red as she did. Jacob straightened himself as well. Sophie turned off the computer and hastily walked out of the room as she pretended to be calm. As she climbed down the stairs with him, she wondered.
A few days ago, I did not like this guy at all. How come I was having so much fun playing games with him?
Jacob was surprised at himself too.
It's late. I should get going,
Jacob said. As he said his goodbyes, Helen turned to Sophie and said,
Go see him off, Soph.
Sophie stood up reluctantly. She was tired. She looked at Jacob and followed him to the door. Jacob turned around when they were on the crosswalk outside of their house. He told Sophie, It's okay. You can go back now.
Oh, thanks, Jacob.
She turned around to go back inside.
Sophie!
Helen's voice was loud and scary. Reluctantly, Sophie turned back again as she looked at Jacob sadly. Jacob and Sophie walked towards the bus stop 500 yards away. They didn't speak a word. The ruffled sleeves of her white t-shirt and her floral red short skirt fluttered in the wind. Jacob looked at her and felt attracted to her. He found her sweet and cute. If it wasn't for their awkward situation, he would have kissed her or asked her out. They reached the bus stop, and Jacob gently asked Sophie to head home. "I know you're tired. The day was pretty overwhelming," he said.
"Yeah."
Sophie nodded with her head down. She suddenly looked up and stared at Jacob for a few moments. Then she turned and began walking back to her house. Jacob realized that he didn't even have her number as he watched her walk away. Even though she was just a high schooler, she should have a cell phone by now, shouldn't she? He kept thinking about her on the bus ride home. Does she even like me?